Unleavened bread. Every year in the spring, we come to the week of unleavened bread. Most common spiritual application of this week usually assigns the definition of sin to leaven. And as leaven is removed from the households and we are to eat only unleavened bread, it is to remind us to remove sin from our lives and not sin. Exodus chapter 12, starting in verse 14. This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to Yahweh throughout your generations, as a statute forever. You shall keep it as a feast. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven out of your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened, from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall hold a holy assembly, and on the 7th day a holy assembly. No work shall be done on those days, but what everyone needs to eat, that alone may be prepared by you. And you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought you your host out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations, as a statute forever. In the first month, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven is to be found in your houses. If anyone eats what is leavened, that person will be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a sojourner or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened in all your dwelling places. You shall eat unleavened bread. In Exodus 12, that was Exodus 12, 14 through 20. However, is leaven really supposed to symbolize sin? In Matthew 13:33, we have, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. So if leaven is supposed to be sin, then is the kingdom of heaven like sin? That it was Yeshua saying, that is what Yeshua would be saying, and that didn't make any sense. Everything of heaven is good. And is there any such thing as a good sin? That would be an oxymoron. Leaven must be symbolically defined as something other than sin. In Matthew 16, 5 through 12, when the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Yeshua said to them, watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they all began discussing it among themselves, saying, we brought no bread. But Yeshua, aware of this, said, O you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Yeshua was always teaching against the doctrines of the Pharisees and Sadducees. He was against their teachings, their schools, their doctrines, the mainstream seminaries of Yeshua's time. And in Mark chapter 7, starting in verse 1. Now when the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the traditions of the elders. And when they came from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. There are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the traditions of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" And he said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you, hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandments of Yahweh and hold to the traditions of men.'" And also in Matthew 23, verse 1 through 36. And Yeshua said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feast and the best seats in the synagogue, greetings in the marketplace, and being called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves, nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes the proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourself. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing, but if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing, but if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, he is bound by his oath. You blind men, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. Whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. Whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of Yahweh and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, faithfulness. These you ought to have done, without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside also may be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous. saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up, then, the measure of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Barakah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Their doctrine was so far off that they were accused as being lawless, negating the word of Yahweh by misunderstanding Moses. Yeshua is teaching us that anything that is against Moses, we are to purge that from our theological framework. Matthew 16:12. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Their teachings negated Moses and were considered lawlessness. We are to beware of such teachings. Matthew 23:28. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Mark 7, verse 8 to 10. You leave the commandments of Yahweh and hold to the traditions of men. And he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandments of Yahweh in order to establish your traditions. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. For Moses said. And then Yeshua goes on to equating the commandment and the word of Yahweh as to what Moses wrote. Their teachings negated Moses and was considered lawlessness. And we are to beware of such teachings. Now they had, in Mark 8:14 to 21, now they have forgotten to bring bread. And they had only one loaf with them on the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Yeshua, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? In Luke chapter 12, 1 through 3. In the meantime, when so many thousands of people had gathered together that they were trampling one another, he began to say to his disciples first, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed on the rooftops. Matthew 23, 1 through 3. Then Yeshua said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach, but do not practice. The Pharisees were hypocritical because they would read Moses verbatim from the seat of Moses, which Yeshua commanded us to do as well. Yet they would not practice Moses in the ways and doctrines, so rendering them hypocritical. So coming full circle, there are two types of leaven. There is the leaven of heaven. In Matthew 13:33, he spoke another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid it in 3 packs of flour until it was all leavened. And there is the leaven that is against heaven, against what Moses wrote, like the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Matthew 16:12. Then they understood that he did not say to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Every Passover, during the week of unleavened bread, we are then left with an interesting scriptural teaching. 1 Corinthians 5:6-8. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Messiah, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. As is the usual practice, the physical ways teach us spiritual understanding. That's why Yahweh gave us these instructions, to teach us. Let's apply the spiritual understanding of unleavened bread with leaven biblically defined as teaching or doctrine. Every year, this means that we are to spiritually cleanse out all doctrine out of our lives, assume that we know nothing, and purge all bias and examine the pure word of Yahweh, his truth, starting from scratch. We are to annually test everything and come back to the true word of Yahweh. Imagine if we really did that every year. The Catholic Church would have never happened. Pagan days such as Christmas and Easter would have never happened. The resulting lawlessness of abolishing his dietary instruction or his Sabbath would have never happened. Instead, we have 2,000 years of doctrine building on prior doctrine, placing themselves on shoulders of the men of the past, and perpetrating and solidifying theological error in the body. So let us reject the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Drop the traditions and doctrines of men. Stop nullifying what Moses wrote and come back to the pure word and truth, the leaven of heaven. Now that we covered the spiritual understanding of getting the leaven out of the houses, how would we physically obey the commandment? How would we observe this commandment? In Exodus 12:19 and 20, for 7 days no leaven is to be found in your houses. If anyone eats what is leavened, that person will be cut off from the congregation of Israel. Whether he is a sojourner or a native of the land, you shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwelling places you shall eat unleavened bread. In order for us to remove leaven from our homes, we need to understand what leaven is. We are told to remove the leaven. The Hebrew word is seor, H7603, from our homes. It is defined as something that swelled due to fermentation. It is a noun derived from the Hebrew word sha'ar, H7604, which means to remain or be left over. So according to the Hebrew, leaven is a product of leavening agent that resulted from fermentation and is left over or the remnant from something larger. Leaven is often misunderstood to be simply yeast. In reality, yeast is all around us. It is even in the air that we breathe. Yeast is a fungus. It is a leavening agent. It is the catalyst of creating leaven, but not really leaven in and of itself. Yeast enables something to become leaven. Yeast is activated when exposed to water and something the yeast can use as food. This begins a fermentation process. When the fermentation process begins, a swelling occurs due to the escaping gas from the yeast as the yeast processes the sugars. So something such as yeast extract that one might find in various food products today is not leaven. Yeast extract is simply a byproduct of yeast. It is added to enhance the flavor of certain food products. The ancient way of creating leaven was to leave out your dough and allow the natural yeast of the air to come into contact with the dough. The yeast would then begin to feed on the dough, and the dough would then become leaven. This would then become a sourdough starter and would be added to the dough. A remnant of the lump or leaven would be left remaining after every batch to be used for the next batch. It was set aside and the process occurred over and over. This is why the Hebrew word for leaven, seor, literally means a lump of old dough in high fermentation. When Scripture speaks of something being leavened, it is speaking of something being mixed with a lump of old dough in a high state of fermentation. Some propose that removing leaven from their households includes cheese or yogurt or wine or whatever, as there is fermentation process with the yeast or bacteria that is involved in producing each of these products. Despite the fact that Hebrew words we observe in the context of leaven was related to a remnant of fermented dough, some believe that the fermentation process that takes place with wine or beer also makes that product leavened, in the sense that it is not permitted to remain in or bought in our households during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Any study done on the sacrificial offerings commanded in Scripture will show that there were at times certain drink offerings that were required. These drink offerings were wine. How does this relate to the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the leavened products? Because wine was to be offered to Yahweh during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, specifically first fruits. In Leviticus 23, verse 13 and 14. And the grain offering with it shall be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, a food offering to Yahweh with a pleasing aroma, and the drink offering with it shall be of wine, 1/4 of a hin. And you shall eat neither bread nor grain, parched or fresh, until this same day, until you have brought the offering of your Elohim. It is a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. This simple evidence that the context and the intent of the leaven we are to remove from our homes is the sourdough starter remnant used to make leavened bread. The biblical definition of leaven is not yeast, a naturally occurring fungus which, when not being mixed with a liquid, is growing and dividing, not breaking down. The same applies to any other living organism that can be a leavened agent, such as bacteria cultures in butter or cheese. Neither the yeast nor the bacteria are leavened, as Scripture defines it. But yeast can be an ingredient in making scripturally defined leaven. The biblical definition, or leaven, is seor, which is a lump of dough that was allowed to sit in the open air for several hours, allowing the naturally occurring wild yeast to begin the fermentation process. It is extremely similar, if not identical, to our sourdough we have today. So when you think of unleavened bread, we're supposed to clean out our homes of it. Instead of homes, think of tabernacle. Clean your tabernacles of leavened bread. And what is our tabernacle? Our body. Clean it of unleavened bread. Get rid of all those old man-made doctrines. And start following Yahweh's doctrines that are written in the scriptures. And with that, Yahweh bless you on this first day of unleavened bread.